So for those who don't know me, I'm a professor at UW-Madison in the Department of Planning and Landscape Architecture. I focus on environmental policy and planning, especially around water, a lot with Wisconsin water issues tied to agriculture and increasingly climate change and resiliency and those sorts of things. And have been part of this water policy group now for a little while. I'm glad to see it continuing and moving in this direction. And happy that you're all able to join us today to hear Eric talk about his case study. Why don't I turn over to you at this point, Raj? We've got a good number of people tuning in. Raj is going to introduce Eric, and then hopefully we'll have an enjoyable presentation with lots of interaction later on.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Ken. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Raj Graywal. I am one of the water policy specialists here at the Center for Water Policy. I graduated from law school, from the Wisconsin Law School, and am back home in Milwaukee, where I am from. So today I'll be introducing Eric. Eric is a community planner and natural resource specialist who has dedicated his life to public service. His current role is a statewide outreach position where he works with hundreds of lakes and watershed organizations to assist them in carrying out the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership ideal, that the state and thousands of landowners can collaboratively care for our water inheritance. This includes planning for and managing aquatic invasive species, as well as developing watershed management strategies that reinforce natural ways to limit pollution coming into lakes. Eric has a BS in urban forestry from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So today, Eric will be presenting on the Wisconsin Healthy Lakes and Rivers program, a multi-year effort to encourage shoreland property owners to engage in behavior changes that protect water quality and provide native habitat around lakes and rivers. The collaborative team behind Healthy Lakes and Rivers includes extension educators, UW-Madison researchers, Wisconsin DNR managers, and other state and local partners. Since 2015, the effort has been successful in 33 Wisconsin counties, with practices installed on 942 shoreland properties. This represents a $1.553 million state investment over that time. Last year, the team began deploying a property owner self-evaluation tool to help steer interested landowners to practices suitable to their specific situations. To increase uptake of the tool and wider awareness of the program, they are exploring the potential value of using digital marketing to reach shoreland property owners in a more targeted fashion. So today's presentation will summarize some of their pilot attempts to create custom audiences in Google Ads and discuss their use of shoreland property owner data in developing the audiences. This work is being supported by an undergraduate intern funded by the UW-Stevens Point Pathways Internship Program. In our discussion, they hope to develop new ideas for using digital marketing to motivate behavior change. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Eric.
All right. Thank you very much, Raj. And thank you, everybody, for taking a little time out of your day to join me here. I'm going to see if I can get my screen share going. And slideshow mode. Is that working for everyone? Good, thank you. So it is nice to see actually some people who I have no idea who you are. I have no recognition of some of the names here. So oftentimes I'm presenting to DNR and to Extension and sort of my own circle of people. So I'm glad to kind of bust this out and get it into a bigger audience. So part of this is going to be just an introduction of who I am and where we're coming from. And then we're going to talk about a little experiment that we've been running out of UW-Stevens Point in the Extension Lakes program. So I'm the director of this office. I'll talk a little bit about Extension Lakes and the Lakes Partnership. I did come dangerously close to staying at Urban and Regional Planning and get a PhD in urban planning, but I sort of changed my mind at the last minute. I love working basically in the policy realm, and I love working with people in the field, out in communities, trying to enact things to bring about, I think, more sustainable and durable natural resource management. So what is the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership? It's great that some of you probably have no idea what this thing is, but it's a lovely thing. It's existed in the state of Wisconsin for about 50 years now, and it's this broad arrangement of sort of scratching each other's backs and helping each other out that at its core really is in this upper left corner, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, which is about 50 years old itself. And And they are charged with protecting and managing our surface water resources in the state of Wisconsin, both the shores of the Great Lakes, but also thousands of inland lakes. And they provide some pretty big muscle to that effort through their staff, through the science that they sponsor and carry out, but also really importantly through the regulatory structure that they create for managing these water resources. They also are able to provide $6.5 million a year in cost share grants out to local governments, lake associations, lake districts, which I'll talk about, and all these different groups to try to carry out the work of taking care of these inland lakes and increasingly rivers and watersheds. This funding is about $13 million a year total, actually, and it's a segregated fund within the Department of Natural Resources, which is to say it doesn't really come up for a lot of discussion in terms of annual appropriations. Instead, this is money, as depicted here in the diagram, that is creamed off of motorboats, because motorboats in Wisconsin run on gasoline today. We don't know if they will 50 years from now, but today they run on gasoline and they have to fill up their tanks at the pumps and they pay a state gasoline tax. And the state of Wisconsin made a decision in the early 1980s to estimate how much gasoline tax does the motorboat users of Wisconsin pay each year. And that money shouldn't go into potholes and bridges. That money should go back into water resources. And so because we have so many boats in the state of Wisconsin and people use them pretty well, we estimate that's about $13 million a year. A piece of that is actually then directed towards our office, Extension Lakes. We historically have been completely dependent on that funding. Just in the last year, we started to receive a sliver of funding from UW-Madison Division of Extension. And our role historically has been to try to do what we're doing today, which is to connect with campuses around the state of Wisconsin, make sure they're aware of this effort in this program, and try and enlist your help, but also to try to show you what we're doing and to be a resource. We get people directed our way all the time who have questions about inland lakes and inland lake management, and we're the people who can answer those calls. And then the other part of this partnership is really our statewide nonprofit partner, Wisconsin Lakes, as well as the meat of this are these hundreds and hundreds of local organizations. Some of them are just nonprofit groups. Some of them can be really, really small. And some of them are local units of government, including counties now. But some of them are what we call lake districts, which are special purpose units of local government, whose main power is the ability to levy taxes in order to carry out programs of lake protection and restoration. So that in a nutshell is the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership. We got together a few years ago and said, well, what again are we focusing on? If this is our partnership, what is our challenge? What are we trying to deal with? And we identified as a group these 4 major threats to lakes. And this is, again, focusing mostly on inland lakes. So the big 4, non-point source pollution, habitat loss, invasive species, and climate change. These are the things that are going to be driving problems in lakes sort of around all around the state. Climate change is sort of a force multiplier for the first 3. It just sort of makes the other 3 even more challenging to take on as storm events get more sort of heavy duty, as different species get to move into the state that previously would have been frozen out as the lakes start to not freeze quite as much. And then habitat loss gets harder to manage again as the climate and the weather changes. And the image here is just a recent image from a lake not far outside of Milwaukee, depicting sort of an example of what we're up against. Shoreland properties are extremely valuable. People love them. People love the lakes, and they want to go in there and play around with them. This is the type of practice we'd like to not see happening. This is not a restoration project. This is someone working on their shoreline access areas in a way that I would suggest is probably not compliant with state standards. So out of those, this discussion today is going to focus mostly on those shoreline zones, the private ring of land around most of our lakes, looking at sort of the lake shores and their disturbance. And it's this statistic, or the numbers you're seeing here, kind of represent the challenge that we're up against. The EPA now has a rotating cycle of water resource assessments that they sponsor in states all around the country to get sort of a national big picture Clean Water Act sense of how are we doing. And they include within that shoreline assessments, trying to look at what's the level of disturbance and habitat loss and sort of maybe erosion and non-point source pollution coming off of shorelands. And if you look at these numbers, you'd say, well, that doesn't look great. We're not going in the right direction. 13% rating poor, then to 16, then to 22. Just last year, they completed the next iteration of this cycle. And so we're still waiting for those final results to come out. If I had to guess, I would say I hope we stopped at 22%, but there's a good chance it went even higher. And this was driven in part most recently by some of the things you've probably seen in your community around the state of Wisconsin, the pandemic driving shoreland property values through the roof as people sought refuges outside of cities and maybe took advantage of some interesting real estate dynamics that were happening that both drove up their residential home values because we can't build houses, and allowed them to take that equity out of urban areas and bring it into the countryside, get more bang for their buck, and put up structures like the one you see on the bottom here, brand new structures in the shoreline zone to look at the lake and relax at the lake. It's hard to blame people for that, but it doesn't work in conjunction with what we want to see happen around lakes if we're going to keep them healthy. In that environment as well, for the last 10 years, we've had some challenges at the political level with the legislature and the governor who weren't exactly in favor of a strong regulatory approach to this, which is to say rules that used to be in place to try to protect the shoreline zone have been systematically weakened. And Professor Scanlon would reiterate this on a very heavy level. I think a lot of her recent work was done around, so what really has been happening in Wisconsin? And the shorelands, both on the Great Lakes and in the inland lakes, have taken the brunt of this. And in the midst of that, one of my colleagues in the DNR had taken the opportunity to go through what we call Lean Six Sigma training, which was popular within the DNR. It's a method of streamlining processes, trying to identify redundancies and try to make it easy for people to do something that you want them to do. And we stepped back and said, well, wait a minute. You know, we're doing this regulatory approach, trying to tell people you can't build this close to the shoreline, you can't cut these trees down, you can't put grass in. But we're really working against those people. We're banging our head against the wall because they want to do these things, and we're trying to tell them they can't do these things. And in the meanwhile, all around all these lakes, there's thousands of people who actually want to do the right thing, but they're not sure where to start, or they don't know how to do this, or maybe they lack the funding to do these things. And we said, you know what, instead of banging our head against the wall, trying to convince people to change their ways or that they don't want to do what they want to do, why don't we work with people who do want to do these things? And why don't we figure out how to make it easier for them? And that was the birth then of what was first initially called the Healthy Lakes Program, and then it was expanded out to be Healthy Lakes and Rivers. We looked at the situation on the landscape and tried to say, well, what if we had to pick like 5 things that people could do, both in the upland zone as depicted here, as in the transition zone right near the shore, and then in the lake, what would we want landowners to do? And in our process, we came up with really 5 things that are actually shown graphically here in color. One of them is we call stormwater diversions. There's places all around lakes because of the slope around a lake. You can get situations where channelized erosion can start to happen, particularly around driveways. We can go in and change that. It's not a really huge engineering challenge. It's just a matter of maybe putting in simple stormwater diversions that don't allow rainwater runoff to form these channelized flows. Rain gardens, people in the Milwaukee area and the Madison area probably have heard about rain gardens. We need in Wisconsin millions and millions of rain gardens to deal with the runoff that's coming off of impervious surfaces like the roofs of homes and cabins around lakes. The shoreline buffer, the area right around the shore, where in a natural environment, that would be an area of just native plants and shrubs and trees. But in our simplified developed environment, we've largely eliminated that and put in turf grass and stones and rocks. So can we get people to put in some small scale shoreline buffers? And then over here is depicted our fish sticks. Coarse woody habitat is another phrase for that, but we go with fish sticks because it's maybe makes more sense for people, but it's not as simple as putting out log structures way out in the lake. This is about near shore complex woody habitat that through research we know we've lost systematically, and through research we know that not having it is weakening the ecological structure of our lakes. So we need more of those in place. Great. So as the introduction sort of hit on, we have been doing this. We have been now several years into this program since 2015. And again, it's not a ginormous amount of money, but it does represent $1.5 million invested over that time. And it's not like we've gotten to everybody. We've gotten to about 942 properties. We're trying to go bigger. We have succeeded at getting this kind of statewide. There's projects running all the way from Lake Geneva in Walworth County, one of the most heavily developed, heavily utilized lakes in the state, all the way up to northern Wisconsin in some of the more primitive areas. Lots of people have found their way into this, and we'd like to say, like, yes, this is good. So we're happy that we tacked into it. But let's be honest about where we're at. Like the National Lakes Assessment data showed, we can go around to Wisconsin lakes and find that we're still have a lot of work to do. This is a lake, maybe some of you on the meeting are familiar with it. It's called Shawano Lake, Shawano County. It's sort of an impounded water body in the upper Wolf River system, and it's heavily developed. It was developed a long time ago. And here's what this is now Wisconsin DNR work that was done, not and in contract with sort of grant recipients. The DNR didn't actually do this. The local county watershed group did this research, but they captured all the shoreline disturbance around this specific lake. This is different than the National Lakes Assessment in that approach is a sampling effort. So they're just doing sort of a random sample of points around random lakes. This is doing a whole lake assessment. So this is a pretty accurate snapshot of what the situation is. 56%, the majority of the shoreline here is just lawn. There are no native plants, there are no shrubs. The disturbance level here on the chart in the lower left shows this is heavily disturbed, not quite the most, but pretty disturbed. And so the work at Shawano Lake is going to be long and multi-decade, and we got to figure out how do we do this. It's not easy. You're trying to tell people again to do things. Now we're not looking at just the people who want to do this, but we're trying to convince more people that they want to do this. And you have to be careful doing that. But we had benefit of working with people from UW-Madison, in particular, Dr. Brett Shaw and a lot of his students who've helped us think this through, sort of what is going to be the best approach to talk to landowners that are beyond that early initial ring of adopters and out into the people that are maybe more skeptical of this. And we did research actually on specific lake people, lake communities, and it did find things that were pretty consistent with a broader set of social science research around behavior change. One of them is this first point here. When we gave shoreline property owners survey or photos of places around their lake and asked them to rate these photos in terms of how good is this doing to take care of their lake, they systematically rated their own shorelines as doing better than their neighbors, even though their neighbors were rating those shorelines as not doing so great either. People just think they're doing a better job than they objectively are. Okay, so self-enhancement bias. They don't see the problem necessarily. And the other part is reactance. It doesn't always work for either county government or a lake association or even the university to come in and just say, hey, you're doing it wrong. Please do something differently. So we have to try to minimize or reduce reactance among this population if we want them to get interested in changing behavior. So the approach that we've taken is kind of to take a look around. We looked at actually the state of Michigan and the state of Minnesota as well to find out how are they maybe tackling the same challenge. And Dr. Shaw, Brett Shaw's work reinforced the idea that really you want people to come to a place on their own, a place of understanding and a place of an idea that they need to change behavior on their own. And there's a broader set of research. Actually, some of it's informed by public health research that says it doesn't always work for like the medical community to just tell you you've got to change your behavior. Sometimes it helps for people to learn that on their own. And so some of you, if you're university employees, you might have been incentivized to take self-assessments for your own personal health that comes along with some results that say, hey, maybe you should do these things. Maybe you should go for a walk more, stop smoking, exercise more, eat less fatty foods, go get a further analysis with your doctor. That same type of approach is what we're using here. It's allowing people to rate their own behaviors and find out on a personal journey of discovery, what might they do differently in order to take care of their lake. So we have the Score My Shore tool. We've only started deploying this in about the last 2 years. It's modeled roughly on a state of Michigan similar web tool. And we're trying to now figure out how do we get more people to take this survey and come to a place of understanding of what their situation is on their shoreline. So even though we have that objective data, all of Shawano Lake, we have really good data. What we want is for people to not look at that map necessarily and see like, oh, this looks bad, but instead take this survey and find out for themselves where they're at. So it has questions like this. This is just one example of a question. You could see if you've done the health assessment with the UW system or the Wisconsin retirement system, you know that's not just one question. It's a whole bunch of questions. This shows you your progress here. You have 26 questions to go. You can save and finish later. And then at the end, you get sort of a results, you know, and in this case, one of my colleagues was taking the questionnaire just to get a sample results and said, okay, you come out at sort of restoration level. You can be worse than that. You could be in what we call entry level. And maybe you're just way over here. You'd be really good. And then your awesome level would be like, oh, you're in protection. You're a shoreland and your property is really healthy, just trying to keep it that way. And then try to give them simple steps that they could take, probably try to ease them into that Healthy Lakes and Rivers program. Maybe you want to think about these 5 practices. This survey is now up and running. People have taken the survey. That's great, but we're still not where we want to be. This, for anyone who's familiar with sort of the idea of adoption of innovations, this is probably where we're at. We're still way over in the early adopter stage. And we got to figure out, how do we ramp up this curve? And the challenge looks kind of like this. This is the Waukesha area in Waukesha County. This gives you a sense of how developed the areas are around the Waukesha lakes. And if you can't see it, there's literally probably 30 different parcels just right in this area here. There's another 20 parcels here. These lakes are super developed, but we can't just write them off. We can't just be like, well, that's too bad, they're going to die. Instead, we have to figure out, using this approach, how do we start to work with these property owners one at a time, or maybe a whole bunch of them at a time, and ease them into this process? And this is where one of my colleagues and we were kind of playing around. We're like, well, wait a minute. Can we, instead of trying to mail out brochures, and this is something that Brett would hit us on all the time, Brett Shaw, like, don't just hit them with brochures. Don't just speak to the crowds at your meetings. That's the in crowd. That's the choir. How do you get to these other people? And I'd say this with a little bit of reluctance, but I'd say that extension in general, the universities as a whole as well, have not really entered the digital era. We're meeting on a webinar. That's great, but that's pretty entry level. The internet is crazy once you start playing around with the different ways that you can reach people and the different tools that are available to you. And most of the world knows this, right? If you're trying to sell bicycles or cars or health products, you've already jumped onto this, but the university is sort of like, wow, this is interesting. There's an internet. And I'm hoping that some of you can share back with me examples of people that are further down this road, because I am just a child playing around with these things right now. But we figured like, well, let's see what we can learn if we play around with this. This is just sort of the basics of what we're getting into, that everybody is using Google and everybody is getting information on Google Ads anyway. Why don't we try to fit into them? And there's a way that you can do this. It's very different from newspaper or print advertising. It's very different from radio and television advertising. You're trying to get specifically to the people. I want to reach Ken. Or you come up with a model. I want to reach people like Ken who own shoreland property, and then you try to tailor it. And then you don't pay just for the fact that you have ads. You pay if someone like Ken clicks on your ad, and then ding, they give you a little charge. So I pitched this to a student that we were able to work with, a UW-Stevens Point student, because students are definitely more technology inclined than people like me who are in their 50s, who maybe are still hunt and peck keyboard people. And I said, hey, let's do this. We have some money here. We want to run some Google ads. Do you think you can figure out how to work this thing? And she said, great, yeah, let's figure this out. So she came on board as an intern in our office, just to help us kind of navigate, what is this like? If you have played around with Google Ads, you kind of, one of the first things you run into is a massive wall of, this is a whole different language. And so you almost have to take some online training to learn how to navigate the interface, just to run an ad, which is kind of funny. And I would contrast that to Facebook. Facebook has tried to make advertising pretty easy, so that just about any schlup can get in there and run a Facebook ad. Google is much more sophisticated. Their audience, I think, is basically big advertising firms who want to then come in and use their tool. So we ran an ad with these search terms. Google will tell you which search terms to use. Everything now is probably artificial intelligence informed on the back end. They want you to succeed. They're trying to figure out ways to make your ad a workable ad. So we picked a geography. We just went in, we said, we want to limit this as much. We want to limit this to Waukesha County. We want to run an ad. And if you've never seen a Google ad, God bless you. That means you don't use the internet much. But for the most part, it looks like this on your phone. If you search, it pops up, it says ad next to it, but it's a bunch of information there. And it's kind of like, oh, maybe I'll click on this. And so we try to get clicks on it. So this is from the interface in Google Ads. This interface also will show you which terms are sort of performing. I still don't know enough to tell you exactly what this means, but it tells you a lot of information about which words are actually getting people to click on your web page. And then you can go in and do it iteratively and start modifying your ad. In this initial ad, we did this back in the fall. And again, our timing wasn't perfect. This is one of the challenges of working in an academic year. You have interns during the school year. It's fall. This is not when people are thinking about their shoreline. But we figured, well, let's just give it a shot, see what happens. So we ran this ad for a while, spent a few $100s, got 312 clicks, broke down to $2 per click roughly. But 35,000 people's eyeballs were exposed to at least this Healthy Lakes concept who otherwise they just would not have seen it. Not clear if that really is going to lead to anything. We'll have to wait a little while, I think, to see where that goes. And then we said, well, okay, that was sort of a quick and easy way to do this. What if we tried to use targeting tools to get a little bit more specific? I said to the student, I said, what can we pull in information? Does Google Ads let us define specific audiences? And she said, yes. And I said, okay, well, what if I told you that I really want this ad to go to shoreline property owners in Waukesha County? She said, I think we can do that. So because we have something in Wisconsin, I showed it earlier, that map of Wisconsin. It's a statewide parcel layer, statewide parcel database. It's a pitched together thing of all the counties' GIS information. Basically, it's a product of a hunting initiative because Scott Walker and the DNR wanted people to find land that they could go hunt on. So we forced all of the counties to make their data publicly available. And what if we could then just parse out who these shoreline property owners are and try and define that as who we want to reach? This is what the layer looks, or what the data looks like when you pull it out of the parcel layer. It's kind of a mess, and every county is going to have a different way of actually presenting this information, which is probably good. It makes it a little bit less easy for people like me to use this for advertising purposes. But all the data we need is in there. And we said, well, we got to clean it though. And so again, this is the good thing about having interns, is that I didn't have to figure out how to clean it. She got it into this format. She didn't have to do this obviously manually. She figured out sort of some different ways to get this in there. But basically, Google Ads is going to tell you it wants these 4 attributes of people. It would love to have their email if you could get that, but we couldn't get that. And we don't really want it. But it says, give us a name, tell us what country they're in, give us a zip code, and we'll start figuring out if we can target those people. So that's a custom audience. And then we also modified the search terms a little bit to see if we could make this ad a little more effective. Try to use some of the iterative feedback information that Google Ads even gives us. Added maybe some different things that they could click on, but again, still driving people. This is an example of what the ad would look like on a laptop or a PC instead of a phone. So we ran basically the old ad, the one we ran the first time, and the new one side by side to try and see what they would look like. And again, we had to do this at a less than ideal time of year, very recently. And you can get a sense of maybe the differences between these. Conversions are basically, again, trying to get someone to actually take the survey. And so round 1 survey, we got 2, and the round 3 survey the modified improved ad got 3 conversions. We got more clicks on the targeted ad, and they were cheaper per click. So there's some algorithm that's being used to try and estimate sort of how much they're going to charge us. We got a little bit more impressions using the more targeted ad. Yeah, if you asked yourself, wait a minute, Eric, is $153 per conversion a good price? I'd say probably not. We'll talk about that in conclusions in a second. Some other juxtapositions between the two. The basic ad that wasn't really targeted really caught people all over the place. And we think that the reason we got a lot more traffic on Fridays was people just looking for a lake, probably to go fishing on, ice fishing or something like that. Whereas when it was targeted just to shoreline property owners, Sunday dominated. But we, yeah, and it was spread out throughout the week though. With that basic ad, when we grabbed all of Waukesha County, Google knows more as a whole about Waukesha County. When we start to narrowly define your audiences, I think Google is going to say, well, we don't know much about these people. So we don't have a lot of demographic information about them. But I would say that we are getting more, this is more consistent with what we know about shoreline property owners, that they do tend to skew older and higher income. I guess the point here is like here on this first ad, 71% of your clicks had known gender and age. And when we did a targeted audience, that dropped down to 42%. So less than the majority. That's what I meant by we didn't really know much about them. Yes. So the overall takeaway, this works. I mean, we can do this more. We could do this all around the state. It's relatively easy to try to actually target these audiences, maybe frighteningly easy. We can do bigger scale. We just did Waukesha County. There's no reason why we can't grab the entire state of Wisconsin and plug it in. Compared to county scale targeting, we can actually, it is worth it probably to do that effort, even if it does take some time to parse and clean a data set and get it loaded in. You could be saving a lot of money that way. I would say, unfortunately, right now, the cost per lead, if you want to call it that, the cost to get someone to complete the survey still seems rather high. We've got to figure out if we can actually drag that down somehow. And part of that is on sort of next steps here in a second. Also, I would admit, as someone who's 52 years old and has almost grown up on computers, this environment is still kind of complicated. It would help if you have anybody in your university who's already working in the Google Ad environment to come with you and sort of Sherpa you through the process. One of the things we struggle with is that to build this web page, I simplified sort of the process. It's not as though if you're in university land, you realize that creating web pages and hosting web pages actually isn't as easy as you want it to be. Especially if you don't want them to be consistent with university branding, especially if you're going to use university money to pay for it, it gets pretty tricky. And so our web page is actually 3 different web pages. It's one that's hosted, part of it is hosted at UW-Stevens Point, part of it is hosted at UW-Madison, and another part of it is hosted in Michigan by the people who created that survey. And trying to get all those web pages to accurately talk to each other all the time has been a bit of a headache. It also means that it's hard to even place you want to place little digital breadcrumbs on these different web pages to gauge your effectiveness. And if they're not my web pages, then I'm asking other people to do it as a polite favor, and that sometimes doesn't work out. And obviously we want to figure out ways to target these timing better. So we're going to try and play around with this in the summer one more time to see if we can, what does it look like when we're actually contacting people at times when they're thinking about their shoreline, as opposed to maybe in the winter time when they got other things on their mind. And I just want to give credit. Allie Spang is the student intern who helped out with this tremendously. I wouldn't be able to do any of this without her help. And the Pathways internship program essentially helped pay for her time working on this. And again, I apologize for this being rushed, but I'm also wanted to leave time for questions and answers. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Eric. So we can go to the question and discussion portion of this event. If anyone has any questions, feel free to either type it in the chat, use the raise hand function, and I can get to those. To start, I do have some questions. This is also a very new area for me as well, so this is very informative and it seems like a lot of work. One of the questions I had is, you discussed wanting to make the ads more targeted. Have you received any feedback maybe around the counties that you have had these projects in, of how like differing language may help, and how do you think that it would be incorporated in the Google ads?
Sure. So I think we do, part of what I breezed over there is this idea of search engine optimization, and the internet will tell you how to use the internet better, and we have to practice more figuring that out. Again, if you're trying to sell bicycles or toothpaste, people are working on that. If you're in our world, we really don't have a lot of people helping us with that, even though I would argue we should. So getting the terminology right, or not even terminology, the phrasing right, the communications and the messaging. Brett is good at this, but Brett is cut in 7 different ways. Lakes is just one little side project of his. And so I do think we need more people who this is their background and this is their expertise, and we need to basically engage them to do this type of work. It is hard to make the argument to justify for that spending, but I would make the case that because we can do it statewide, maybe that can be actually centralized. So let me give you the example. If Shawano Lake says, okay, we want to do this, how do we do it? Do we have to hire our own person? I would say, no, you don't have to hire your own person. we can have somebody in Madison or in Stevens Point and give them Shawnee Lake as just one of their projects. And they can run these digital ads. They don't need to know who the local newspapers are. They don't need to know who the local contacts are. They can just run it in the background. And another example I'd give around better targeting is that when we derived our target audience of shoreland owners in Waukesha County, we just said, give us all the shoreland property owners. Well, in the Shawano County example, I said roughly half of these property owners have grass and the other 50% are maybe in a better place. Why not just select the 50% that you're looking for? As we get more and more lakes where we have this objective data of shoreline condition, why would I spend any money advertising this to people who are already in a good place with respect to their shoreline? Why wouldn't I narrow it even tighter to focus on a target audience whose behavior change we're trying to modify? Whose behavior we're trying to modify. Sorry, I hope that. And then I think the trick with the local audience is like letting them inform maybe the keywords that are being used, and try to run it past them, if you will.
All right, thank you. We did get a question in the chat. So how does /Mite your targeting individuals with the Google Ads approach compare to working collectively with groups through organizations such as lake associations using their contact lists?
Yeah, I think they could complement each other and they should complement each other. This whole thing will work best when there are some local people having these conversations. And the same thing goes, I think, with any Google advertising type of campaign. If you're hearing it through multiple channels, there's a chance it gets through your head. So the hope would be that if there's a local community conversation happening where they're doing little open houses or they're having meetings about it, it does get in the paper, that maybe the audience that we're trying to hit, their eyeballs see it in one place, then they see it in another place, then they see it in their Google Ads. And the thing of it is like, the Google Ads is nice because maybe it is that Sunday morning when they're just sitting there having coffee and the ad, they're like, okay, what can I do with my shoreline? The ad pops up. They don't have to search anymore. They don't have to try and figure it out. It ought to be served up to them as easy as possible. And then they click on it and then they start going through. So the community events we know will always get just a small slice of the overall pie. And I still think those are going to tend to be the early adopters. It's that middle group that we're really trying to get at. We also want to make sure that this is coupled with, say, a county, either the Lake Association or the county needs to be ready to deal with what happens if someone not only takes the survey, they get their score and they're like, oh, it tells me I should contact my land and water office to get some ideas. Okay, well, that phone number better be pretty easy to find. So in our 2.0 version of the survey, we do actually want to have kind of a next steps menu that's a little bit easier to follow for someone who does bother to complete the survey, to make it easier for them to take the next step.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Is anybody else doing this stuff? I feel like I almost want to find like an online advertising user group of social behavior change people who are trying to realize like, oh yeah, we gotta stop printing these brochures now and just start getting right into their devices, because this is it. This is the game, at least for the next 10 years. People are going to be getting their information on their phones.
I'll just raise a general question around this. Thanks again for presenting this, Eric. I've heard you and Brett talk about this before, and it's a good reminder of how quickly a lot of the targeting technology in particular is developing and how to think about using it for research or for outreach purposes. I was just meeting with a group of students this morning who's working in Richland County. Actually, Raj is a WRM cohort at UW-Madison, and they're trying to think about identifying landowners throughout that portion of the driftless area with particular land characteristics. And the idea was to find the parcel level database and then to extract from that addresses. Often those are in the name of a trust of some sort, and how to contact them. And the idea was to send them, outreach by US mail and see if they respond. And I wonder if you have any insights on the approach you used here, how that might apply in a more rural setting like that. Just thoughts, not necessarily for one sub-watershed, but if you're trying to look at landowners in driftless area with potentially restorable wetlands for climate resiliency purposes, what challenges might you see trying to reach very specific audiences like that with this, and then motivating them to respond and register some level of interest and follow-up?
Sure. I guess my advice would be, again, this is only one piece of an overall approach.
Oh,
So
yeah.
maybe think of it as and maybe treat it as a little bit of an experiment and see if there's any takers. I don't want to say neat, but what we hope is the ideal thing is that you can see whether there's results or not. So Google Ads is really set up again to sell things like toothpaste. And if
Yeah.
you had somebody working with you, they would say, well, you're selling toothpaste online. What we want to do is measure how many sales did you get, and even how much sales did you get. So that's where we're in an awkward place, because like we're not selling toothpaste. There is no dollar value attached to what we're doing here. But what they want to demonstrate to you is that there's bang for your buck. So think about where you want these people to go, and think about how many web page visits you want to get there, or what is the action you want them to take that might deal with the digital realm. At least, I mean, right now, I think a lot of the rural folks are getting, again, this device is going to be everywhere. It's not, you can't say like, oh, we're in a rural area, nobody has a cell phone. They're all going to have cell phones. And connectivity is getting better. So I wouldn't use that as any reason not to do this. But think hard about where you want to send people. Because if you're selling stuff, it's almost easy. It answers itself. When you're not selling stuff, it's like, well, you got to think through. What are we trying to get them to do exactly?
Yeah.
And in my case, again, it was try to get them to complete that survey. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the insights.
So you did say this was just one piece of the puzzle. I'm curious, you mentioned that you would reach out or like send things in the mail. What are like other strategies that Extension and the program have been using?
Sure. So for example, if you go to the Healthy Lakes webpage, there's this thing on the bottom of it that talks about partner organizations. And so the idea there is that we ought to leverage these lake associations and let them create sort of their own version, if you will, of the Score Your Shore tool, and then they would promote it locally. And they would also have access to the results, sort of see what people are saying about their shoreland. And it might give them a sense of what are the consistent things that people are reporting out that need work or that they should focus on. So we have about 10 lake groups around the state that have already come on board as sort of partners. And we're still trying to navigate through like, how do we help them help us do this? But as they promote that locally, what they then do is they're putting it in their Facebook messaging, their newsletter, linking it off of their web page. That ought to be a more authentic way, I think, to drive traffic in as well. I think over time too, there's going to be questions around how do you demonstrate that this was that we're making a difference. So I mentioned like we have this unfortunate trend in the EPA National Lake Assessment work that at least tells us what the background tendency is. If we can stop bleeding and start healing things, that'll be a good sign that we're going the other way. But we can keep doing these specific shoreline assessments and try to use that as well to let people know where to go. I didn't have a link, and I'm on a laptop, so I don't have multiple screens going. But it's the Shoreline Condition Viewer, I believe it's called, within Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Lets any lake group that has had that survey work done at least have a conversation with their property owners about what are their challenges, or how big of a lift do they have at their lake. I hesitate to get a lot of people to do that, because again, at Shawano Lake, they'd say, ooh, we're not in really great shape. We have a lot of work to do. And it can be easy to say, then it's just not worth it. Things are just fine the way it is. We'll just stick with what we have. But if we can somehow triangulate to the surveys, the Score Your Shore versus the objective lake assessment, and then track over time, like what happens if Shawano Lake gets revisited in 7 years' time? Did things get any better? And because we had the whole lake assessment, we could say, well, where did things get better? And what was the characteristics of the property owners that led them to change their ways? We also have a belief that maybe it's contagious, that if one, and we've seen this in some sort of anecdotal ways, but if one property owner puts in that shoreline buffer or that a little shoreline garden, then the neighbors start to pick it up. And so we want to really find out, is that bearing out in the data in the field?
Thanks, Eric. I did drop that link into the chat for you, along with a couple of them while you were talking.
Thanks, I appreciate that. You being my co-pilot here.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I wonder if there aren't other questions, if we want to wrap this one up early and let Eric get to his other panel that he's about to run to at this conference. Or
Yeah.
Stephanie, did you come on with a question in mind? Okay.
Okay.
I actually was just gonna say, I am so sorry. I missed basically your entire talk. I was in another meeting
That's
and
okay.
it ran long and then I hopped in but I was really interested to hear it for a number of reasons. But one of them is I'm part of a research team that's looking at harmful algal blooms in Lake Winnebago and associated lakes. But a real focus of our project is on understanding people's perceptions and attitudes and behaviors towards the lakes and the blooms in particular. So anyway, I just was basically saying hello. I was really interested to hear your research, and I was hoping to talk with you a little bit about it so I can get in touch with you separately.
And you'll be able to watch the recording, number one. And number two, I would also say I gave shots out to Brett Shaw. I would say reach out to him too. He's a really collegial university faculty member, and he's trying to work on this search engine optimization thing around PFAS. And he's trying to use like the internet, all the knowledge of the internet to be like, well, what are people looking for? And I think with harmful algal blooms and blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, some of the same things are probably going to pop up as PFAS. Like, how do I know if this is safe? What am I dealing with here? And we might as well let people tell us what they're looking for so we can help them find good information instead of getting pulled into rabbit holes.
Yeah, thank you for that.